asking yourself, why does patient experience matter? Patient experience matters because happier people means healthier people. Research shows that improved patient experience leads to better patient outcomes, better prevention and disease management, and reduced readmission rates. This essentially means that patients and family members feel more prepared when they're leaving the hospital and are less likely to have to come back.
So today we're going to talk to you about a set of tools we've designed over the past year. The first is a research book for patient caregivers. The second is a set of workshops to collaborate with clinical staff. And the third is the use of stories to build empathy. In the end, we'll talk to you about our integrative design process and bringing all these tools together in a toolkit.
Over the past year, we've spent more than 500 hours in observations, 256 hours in interviews, and 192 hours designing with patients, caregivers, clinical staff, and administrators at the hospital. Not only have we engaged the core clinical staff, but also spoke with security and environmental staff who might be considered at the peripheries of the system, but have a huge impact on how patients and caregivers experience the hospital. These numbers don't really begin to tell the story of what we've experienced at the hospital. So today, we choose to not show you a bunch of numbers, but tell you 3 stories.
Our first story starts with Anna, a therapy dog at Michigan Medicine. We find her as she comes across a wife of a critical care patient who's having the worst day of her life.
Hi, I'm Anna, and I'm a dog. I'm a therapy dog. I work at Michigan Medicine Health System, and I have the best job in the world. I'm kind of a big deal around here. I have this superpower of sniffing out people who are sad and lonely and making them happy. People always have a smile on their face when I'm around. Today, I was on my way to a patient's room, and I noticed this woman coming out of the bathroom.
What a beautiful dog.
I saw her eyes light up. I could tell I reminded her of someone from home. I was immediately drawn to her because she looked so sad.
I didn't know you had dogs in the hospital.
She began talking to my trainer. My trainer asked her about her day, and she began talking really loud.
I'm not doing too good. My husband had come in for a routine procedure and ended up having a kidney removed, and we didn't even know. They don't come in volunteering information. I have to go and ask them, how's he doing? What's going on? I'm running on 2 hours of sleep. My husband is in critical condition. I'm stressed out. I'm just exhausted.
She stopped talking. I looked at her, and she smiled. I see a lot of people like her at my job.
This story comes from the hundreds of hours we spent in the hospital doing ethnographic research, and it really gets to the heart of the issues family caregivers face every day as they try to navigate the complexity of the health system. Caregiving is hard. It is a new reality that is full of unknowns. It is also a full-time job because we're constantly having to advocate for our patients. As we began hearing from more and more caregivers, we began asking ourselves, how might we support them in navigating the unknowns of the hospital? Caregiving can feel like walking around in the dark and not knowing whether you're going in the right direction. We constantly heard caregivers tell us, I don't know what I don't know. The hospital does have many resources to support families and caregivers, but how do we build an awareness of these resources? How do we give caregivers a flashlight to illuminate them from the darkness in which they find themselves? Here, we saw the opportunity to design a resource book. The Need Something resource book is a quick guide to the resources available in the hospital. Resources such as the pet therapy dog we just heard from, Anna, who brings smiles to everybody's faces. It begins to answer some of the most frequent questions we get from family caregivers. Questions like, where can I get a bite to eat? How can I distract myself? Where can I go to find some peace of mind? As we began designing this resource book, we realized that we really wanted to give patients and caregivers a sense of control. We wanted to give them something that was human, something that was comfortable, and something that was colorful to break the monotony of being stuck in the hospital. The design process of this resource book also took many iterations, as Bruce mentioned. We went through many different prototypes. We worked with both nursing staff and hospital administrators to make sure that this book began to work for everyone. To make sure that it actually did work for everyone, we began to pilot this book on a surgical unit in the hospital. We piloted about 200 copies of this book for over 5 weeks, and we began evaluating how this resource book was actually working. During our time in the hospital, doing these evaluations, we heard from a 67-year-old woman, a patient who was having a really hard time. She was housing unstable, and she had had frequent visits to the psych unit. She was kind of hesitant to talk to us, but as she began to open up, she began to tell us that she'd actually called for a spiritual advisor because she had read about it in the resource book. She began to tell us that she was so glad that she had called for the advisor and that the nurse had given her this resource book. During our pilot, we realized that this resource book was actually a tool. It was a tool for not only patients and caregivers, it was giving them a flashlight into the resources that were available in the hospital. But this resource book was also a tool for us. We called it a deliberate probe to understand and navigate the complexities of the hospital. For caregivers, we were giving them back a sense of control, a feeling like they can actually do something for their patients and for themselves. We know that bringing awareness and giving a better sense of control can make us better advocates for ourselves and our patients. For us, we use this tool because we knew that this resource book was not the be-all, end-all. This was not the solution to all the complex issues that caregivers face every day. We saw this book as an intervention. We saw it as our flashlight into the system. We used it as a window to see the complexities, the hierarchies, the varying cultures that were within the hospital, and begin to make sense of something that was as complex as healthcare.
So next we're going to hear from a nurse named Tony, who struggled to get a glass of water for a patient caregiver for about an hour and a half, and you'll understand why.
12:45, fire alarm goes off. We realized it's a drill, but it's thrown off our routine. 12:47, Thompson, bed 2, needed to be given digestive medications before he can have lunch. Beeper goes off. Wife in room 638 asks for water with ice. 12:50, need to chart that I gave medications to Thompson, bed 2. Nurse aide interrupts to tell me that she has to go sit with a patient on suicide watch. 12:51, walking to nourishment room for ice. Walking back and clerk stops me to ask a question about my patient, room 609. Have to put down a glass of water because Tina asked for my help. Tina's getting her patient ready for surgery. Needs help lifting patient onto a gurney for transport to surgery. Pager buzzes again. Patient with catheter needs to change catheter. 1:30. Quickly chart that I changed the catheter at the standing charting station. 1:45. Finally, after an hour and a half, deliver glass of water to caregiver.
I think it's safe to say nursing is hard. This story is based on our observations from a real incident that happened during the research portion of our work earlier in last spring. So as you heard in the story, it took the nurse about an hour and a half to get this glass of water because of the other interruptions that came along the way. So issues that were more important or more urgent that he needed to deal with more immediately. So the creativity on the fly that we see oftentimes from nurses comes in these scenarios and is incredible. And when the nurse finally handed the caregiver the cup of water, we realized that nurses are often the face of the hospital to the patients and caregivers, and are the front line of patient and caregiver experience. So as we observed this creativity, goodwill, and knowledge throughout, we thought, what better group of people to partner with as we designed the resource book? Any effort to improve patient and caregiver experience without them would be severely lacking. especially if we wanted to understand the true nature of challenges to patient care. But as we heard in the story, nurses are already pretty busy. They're overworked, they're constrained, and they often don't have a lot of extra time, which doesn't leave a lot of time for non-clinical projects. So if we were going to partner with nursing, we needed to do so in a way that accounted for their availability and respected the preciousness of their time. So we asked ourselves, how might we design creative ways of partnering with nursing on the patient experience? So first, we knew that we needed to work within the nurses' time constraints. When we were offered 45 to 60 minutes, for example, during a monthly nursing meeting, we jumped on it. But most importantly, we were hoping to use stories like the ones you've heard as provocative prompts to ground and channel the creativity and problem-solving capabilities that nurses inherently own. So as we constructed these workshops, we based them on the issues, good and bad, that had arisen from our initial pilot of the resource book. And we used stories that patients told us about the resource book as grounded, so that everyone in the room began with a similar point of reference. Then we prompted them to think about and help us understand the needs and motivations of the individuals in the stories. And then once everybody felt like they were on the same page, we were able to have some fun. So we led nurses through a series of activities designed to provoke creativity and idea generation around the issues at hand. And because of the intuitive, fast-thinking nature of nurses, we got really good input and really good ideas. But most importantly, in taking a collaborative approach, the resulting ideas were much more holistic and sustainable than they would have been had we gone it alone. But the true crux of these workshops, we realized, was the empathetic connections with stories. Take this excerpt as an example. The woman speaking here was anxious about taking her husband home and perhaps taking care of him improperly. She says, "So yeah, I emotionally felt like I can take him home and kill him easily." She's very nervous about doing something wrong once he's home and out of the care of the hospital team. But one of the nurses in the workshop responded in saying this: "I can't disagree with the caregiver's fears. I think maybe it might be 99% exaggeration, but it is her perception and her reality, and we need to respect that." So time and time again, empathy led the way to successful collaborations. Experiencing a renewed sense of empathy, reconnecting with patients and caregiver needs, paved the way for the team building and problem solving that produced insights in how to proceed with the resource book. But not only were these workshops meaningful for us and nursing staff, but our project partner, luckily, Molly White, also saw them as a tool for making meaningful change within the hospital and as a way to scale the work of the Office of Patient Experience.
Our third story is an excerpt from the many conversations that we've had with Molly White over the last 1.5 years. Here, she talks to us about a time when a panel of patients and families were brought together to evaluate a Hygiene Kit initiative that was to be introduced throughout the hospital by the Department of Infection Control.
And they have these amenities like hairbrushes and toothbrushes for general hygiene. And we had an African American woman on our panel. She said, that stuff wouldn't work in my hair. Right. And it was like, holy smokes, how many people did they have that look at? I don't know, but if she hadn't happened to say, you're like, oh my God, you're right. And what a huge oversight that has been. And I said, do you have products for different hair? And the person said, I don't know. So I said, go look and fix this.
So this story really gets to the fact that hospitals care about patients and caregivers. They mean well. The fact that these resources exist and are available to patients and caregivers shows that the hospitals care about the small things that have a huge impact on patient and caregiver experiences. But sometimes things do fall between the cracks and peripheral voices remain unheard. In her work with the groups at the hospital, Molly often uses this story and many others to teach the importance of patient and caregiver experiences to improve the way clinical staff work with groups in the hospital. At this point, you must all be wondering, why do we keep telling you these stories and talking about them? Let me ask you this. Did you feel the anguish that the wife in the dog story felt as she thought about the time that the patient was in a very bad condition? Maybe it reminded you of a time when you felt the same in a similar situation. Did you feel the same anguish that the nurse in the story felt as he was repeatedly feeling completely exaggerated and felt like, just a second.
Overworked.
Sort of feeling overworked in the sense that every time the nurse was being interrupted as they were trying to get a glass of water to caregivers, maybe it reminded you of a time when you felt the same overburdened responsibilities with slipping away time. Or maybe you were able to relate with Molly as she was feeling that the hospital had let down this woman as in, I'm so sorry, I need some water.
Go ahead. So maybe you felt the same way when someone's forgotten about you in a situation like this, where we're thinking about your needs in the hospital.
This is really the power of story. Stories bring us together. They make us feel like we belong. They remind us of all the people and all the experiences we've had in life. We remember the stories that our grandparents told us. And I think Priyanka will continue the story. And there's the water.
Speaking of stories.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
This is the power of stories. They make us laugh, they move us to tears, and they remind us of a time when all of us were together. Humans have been sharing stories since forever and have shared knowledge in the form of stories. But in the hospital, where life and death decisions are made every day, where every individual is having the best or worst day of their life, knowledge is shared in the form of facts and figures. These facts and figures are incomplete. They show an incomplete picture, but when paired with patients and caregiver stories, they start to show a more holistic view, a view that we can easily relate with and be engaged with. In our work, the stories that we used were the crux of our experience. We were able to use stories as a tool that helped change the way people thought about expectations, relationships, and values. People were able to change the way they related with different points of views. They were able to think about how can stories start creating change. In our work with the Office of Patient Experience, we realized we have created these three tools: a resource book that help the caregivers, workshops that help us collaborate, and stories that help us build empathy. But the question now was, how do these tools fit with the work of the Office of Patient Experience? So let us look back at our journey.
We began to ask ourselves, how might we bring together these tools to support the work of the Office of Patient Experience? You heard from me earlier about the resource book and how the resource book helped us look into the system. Similarly, we've seen the way Molly uses nursing meetings to look into and figure out how initiatives work within the system.
So this is how we, meaning myself, Priyanka, Prerna, have understood and practiced integrative design in this context. We understand that caregiving is hard, nursing is hard, improving patient experience in the hospital is especially hard and perhaps wicked. And this calls for an approach that breaks silos, brings people together, and brings them together around human needs.
So the question now is, how do we bring all these tools together to support the work that the Office of Patient Experience is doing? We essentially realized that all these tools need to come together in a toolbox that then Molly and her team can use and adapt to their specific needs. This led to the creation of the Stories for Care toolbox. This toolbox essentially guides groups to work together in collaborative workshops that are centered in stories. These workshops help groups discover problems, build empathy, and collaboratively generate solutions which cater to the patients and caregiver needs. The toolbox is divided into 3 sections: learning workshops, doing workshops, and teaching workshops. This is in line with how the Office of Patient Experience works with groups within the hospital. They follow the model of learn, do, teach as they work in the hospital. Each section lays down a progression of activities that help groups work through the specific purposes of the workshop. Each section also includes insights into how people can work towards either framing the workshop or use stories to ground participants, and also a few tips and tricks that can channel the creativity and problem-solving skills of everybody in the room. So right now, we are working closely with the Office of Patient Experience to sort of include the knowledge that we have in the form of human-centered design and the knowledge of stories, and include the knowledge that our partners have of the health system to create a more inclusive toolbox that is holistic and more equitable.
Over the course of this presentation, you've heard us talk about 3 tools. You've heard us talk about the resource book, which created change within the hospital by giving caregivers the sense of power and control. You've also heard us talk about creative workshops that brought nursing staff together to collaborate on things and collaborate on different projects and bring together creativity and problem-solving skills. And you've also heard us talk about how stories can be used to ground people and to reconnect them to the real needs of patients and caregivers. And all of this has come together within a toolbox that is centered around powerful stories. This is the first was a book. We did these nursing workshops, which led us to this toolbox. Stories are powerful. They bring us together, and they make meaningful change. Us, along with our project partners, Molly, believe in improving the patient experience, improving the experience of that wife that you heard from in the caregiver story that Anna told us. Improving the experience of that nurse you heard from who was having a really hard day. And improving the way in which Molly works, and improving the way in which that she begins to reach out and partner with groups. We want people and our project partners to feel respected, to feel like they have the tools that they need. We are hoping that our approach and our way of working can make this happen. And we believe that when we give people tools, we empower them to fix the problems in their lives or begin to come together and work towards a better solution. And we hope that our tools are just one step forward in this journey. And we hope that these tools, in a small way, begin to have us become happier and healthier. Thank you.
So this is question and answer time. So please, we have plenty of time. Hopefully, there's some things that you want to know more about. So we'll let Prerna, Priyanka, and Scott handle the questions themselves.
Any questions?
Don't be shy. Okay, right.
Yes.
What did each of you learn from being experienced personally and then together?
Can you repeat that question? Yeah. Do you want to?
What did you all learn individually going through this project and also collectively together?
Always answer that one. Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, what I think this reinforced in me, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think we all at least agree on this, is that, it's so important anytime you create something new or a solution or an intervention for someone or a group of people, people are always involved. And so it's important to actually go to those people in the creation of those solutions. It's part of this integrative process. What we're doing is so based on actually going to the people that you're designing for. And I think I feel like the work that we've done is sort of proven that out to me in ways that I was already pretty sure about. But we've got to speak up a little bit. Okay. What do you guys think?
Yeah, sorry. I think the biggest learning that we've had is the realization that how complex the healthcare system is. We could have gone in very easily and saying that this is the one solution that we want to try and pilot it and see whether it's working or not. But what we chose to do was to work with people and learn constantly over an engaged period of time and understand how each solution or each intervention as you're introducing it into the system, how do they sort of have downstream consequences and how that affects the whole ecosystem that we're working with. And how we need to be conscious of the fact that every action that we're taking has a reaction in ways that we might not even understand. So being understanding of that and knowing that we are always entering a more ambiguous environment and being comfortable with that, that's the biggest learning that we've had and personally I've had.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think what I personally have learned is I've learned so much from my team. I think that's been the biggest learning for me personally. Within this project, I've learned so much from not only Scott and Priyanka, but all our partners, Molly, Sandra, John Swerple, I mean, all the countless of people that we've met. And I think like Priyanka was mentioning, one of the biggest learnings was actually trying to make something and trying to put it into the system. We thought, we'll make a resource book, how hard could that be? And we spent, I think, almost half a year trying to put that thing together and trying to make it work, iterate through it, make sure that everybody along the way felt comfortable with it, felt like, yeah, this could be something I could use. And I think that's been sort of the biggest learning is trying to do something, even as small as a resource book, trying to put it into a system as complex as Michigan Medicine, and beginning to see and unravel all the mysteries and all the hierarchies and all the connections and all the well-meaning, and recognizing that sometimes breakdowns just happen because systems are not necessarily sometimes thinking about the human. Yes, all the way in the back.
How did you follow up with caregivers that were utilizing the resource book? And at what time point? And did you only do inpatient or did you also try it in outpatient settings?
This resource book was introduced in the inpatient settings. That's where we chose to start because we had more access and it was easier to pilot and evaluate the resource book. And what we did was we spent more than 3 days in the hospital speaking to inpatients in various conditions. And through semi-structured interviews, we tried to understand when did they receive the resource book, how did they use it, did they even remember to use it when they needed it. And we had a very interesting feedback in the evaluation. And one of the biggest challenges we realized in the evaluation was also that the time in which the resource book is given to the patients is a time when they're most distraught. They have no sense of what's happening around them because either they are being stepped down from the ICU and they're still groggy, or they're coming up from the ER and they're exhausted. And this sort of started getting to the fact that a lot of times information is given to patients in a time when they're not aware or not in the state of mind to understand what's happening around them. And our learning sort of then improved how we deliver the resource book and introduced it to patients in the inpatient settings.
Yeah, and really during our evaluation of talking with patients and recognizing that this wasn't really the right time, we introduced this resource book during the admissions process. So as soon as the patient and caregiver is admitted, they get a whole admission packet, and along with the packet, they got this book. And we realized that that wasn't actually the right time to get the resource book. So a lot of our time spent with nursing and collaborating with them in workshops was really trying to figure out, well, how can we redistribute this book? When is the right time for somebody to feel like they can receive information? So that's a lot of what our work and our evaluation of the resource book has been.
So just to follow up on evaluation, so the workshops that we did originally with the nurses on the floor were because of the feedback that we got on the resource book and some of the things that Prerna mentioned about, people not being ready for it when they received it sometimes in the middle of the night. And so in that way, we tried to hit all angles. I mean, we went back to the people who were actually using it. We went back to the floor where they were actually distributing it and talked to people that were on the receiving end and also on the distributing end. And then that was really where the workshops were born out of, where we went, oh, wait a second. Actually, the way that we're engaging with people on this floor is kind of useful as well, and maybe that's its own learning. But that was understanding the resource book from all angles was always a core part of that project. Yeah.
I really appreciate the work that you guys have put into this, not only the ability to listen, but also be able to document and disseminate something. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the finite character of the film, and whether or not you see the sort of stories for change and how stories change over time, and sort of like what is the next step of this type of a thing for you? Is it a more dynamic book, or do you feel like it is locked in? I mean, I'm looking at this image, and there's so much information in this one image on the table. I'm wondering, are there more stories to tell, and how would you keep telling?
Did somebody plan you? Because that's a perfect question. This is perfect, because this was actually an activity where, so if you think back to the activities that we laid out in sort of this toolkit, just learn, do, teach, this is learn. And so the idea is the resource book is one thing that could be born out of those three phases. But the idea is that all the learning, the interventions are ultimately born out of what you learn in that first step. And this is an example of a workshop where we went and spoke to a patient family advisory committee and asked them, tell us about the experience that you had in the hospital and what it was like, what your highs and lows were in taking care of that patient. And then let's look at what the highs and lows were in aggregate and understand where the biggest issues are, and then use that to pull out, okay, where do we need to focus? And so, in one instance, we realized from our observations early on in the project, that was not as structured as this. It was just us discovering the context was that people there are resources for caregivers, but they just sometimes don't know where they are. And so I would imagine that similar findings would be born out of this. And so the idea with taking this forward into a toolkit is that hopefully that provides an opportunity to do more insight that leads to more appropriate interventions later on.
And we've heard, similar to your question, we've been working with Molly, our project partner, and how can we start documenting a lot of this work, which is just stories being shared as anecdotes. How can we start documenting them and then share with the system so that these stories become a form of data for the system, instead of just conversations that people are having in the system and getting lost.
So I have a couple questions, but I'll just stick with one. Full disclosure, I'm a C4, so great work. But wanted to ask you, how has participating in this process, this 2-year process, you think going to influence and inform your career and your practice moving forward?
I have more than one answer, so I'm only going to give one. You guys go for it.
Yeah, the 2-year process, I think, 2 years back when I came in, I had a sense of this program to be, I will be working in a team collaboratively on real-time projects and to be studio-based. That's all that I understood. But the kinds of projects that we've done, the people that we've worked with, it is that relationship that has helped us grow as designers, to value the relationships, value conversations, listen, see. Those are the kinds of things that we've been doing as we've engaged in this project. And the fact that we've been given the kind of access that we have with this project allowed us to learn not at just the individual level, but also at a system level, to understand how complexities start sort of guiding how people interact within a system also was a huge learning for us through this project.
I think what I'm going to take back with me is, I thought we knew what complex was, and I thought I knew what wicked was, but I think I have a much better sense of what wicked is now. I think Molly has a much better sense of what actually wicked looks like working in the hospital. And so I think what I'm going to take with me is the fact that we can't be paralyzed by the fact that there are so many people and we're accountable to so much, and that at any moment things can go wrong, and it could be life and death decisions. Yes, we know that. But we have to start small, and we have to just try something. And I think that is what I'm going to take with me as I move forward.
So I think that point about like inaction also has consequences is really crucial. But what I would liken it to is, I don't know how everybody learned to drive a car, but some people read the book first and then get in the car, and I think we just got the car with my parents. But it's different. You know, if you read the book, if you learn about something, you read about it, it's different than experiencing it. And so I know I came in here knowing that there were things going on in design, broader applications for design that I wasn't participating in, but I wanted to be a part of. And I read about it, seen other people doing it, and I thought, ooh, I think I could do that. But until you actually spend 2 years digging in on an entirely new type of project, and you have, of course you're accountable, which makes it real. You're accountable to real partners, but you also have access to advisors, mentors, peers that can help you along the way. And it's just been, I would liken it to, not coming here would have been like reading the book about driving and then going and taking the driver's test. And this was go out in the car with your parents in the parking lot for a few days before you get on the road. John is our driving instructor. and Bruce, and everybody, sorry, not anybody else.
I thought we saw another hand at some point.
I think Brad had a question.
Yes.
I can let other people.
Okay. Yes, and the doctor?
This is concerning the resource book, but I was wondering if you see this going deeper into hospitals, like different departments within. And I was kind of curious about if you would make it geared towards a children's hospital, making like a resource book that's maybe a little more innocent and less scary for children to kind of understand what's going on and what resources are available to them without doctors kind of, I don't know, kind of scaring them with everything that's going on with them.
Yes.
So, 2 parts to that question. The first part, how does this resource book start working in other units? We did start seeing how can we design the resource book in a way that it can be applied in different parts of the hospital, but we quickly realized that every unit in the hospital has a very different culture. The resources that are available to them are very different. So the way we design the book is that within the system, whether it's nurses, whether that it is the Office of Patient Experience staff, they can start localizing it to their own units. What we are trying to do by the end of this year is provide a template of this resource book to the system so that they can then start localizing it to their own needs in different ways. And it would be great if the Children's Hospital can take something like this and start using it to make the hospital experience for children a little less scary. And I'm sure Molly can talk about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, Molly, do you want to answer?
Well, I would just say that with everything, we pilot and then we see what's scalable. And this was a 32-bed unit, and there are 1,000 beds in the hospital. So the next phase would be for us to operationalize how you take something like this that's been a success and you work in more measurements. Then we move it across. Children's Hospital, actually, that's one of the reasons you guys chose to work on adult space. They have an enormous amount of resources and already a lot of things to try to offset that scariness, and we're trying to replicate that on the adult side. Doesn't mean you need to stop on the children's side, but this has been a great, fun project, which is something that we can really use, so it's a great one.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Going once, going
Yeah.
twice. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
About 5 years ago, I got called into Robert's office. I had no idea why. He told me to sit down, and then he made that sigh that people make when they have bad news. I figured that logistics or funding or both weren't working out for the research trip my class was about to take to Johannesburg. He took a moment, and then he told me, last week I found out that I have ALS. For those who don't know, ALS is the same neurological disease that took Stephen Hawking's life just a few weeks ago. It's a terminal diagnosis that sucks. Basically, you slowly lose control of your muscles. For Robert, it started in his wrists, then moved to his arms, then his legs, and his lungs. He died 2 years later at the age of 47. That day in his office, though, he answered my questions about his diagnosis calmly, and then he asked a favor. He said, "I'm not ready to tell everyone yet, so while we're traveling, I need you to make sure that nobody notices I can't carry my bags." And I said, "Absolutely." Robert was one of those professors in undergrad who made the experience great. He was vibrant and amazing and thoughtful and kind. And he was the first professor to introduce me to concepts in ethics and to ask really tough questions about my work. Not only about what I was making, but about how I was making it and why. That was one of hundreds of conversations Robert would have about his disease. For the next few years, I watched him navigate his life with ALS with incredible strength and grace. But I know that for him and for his family, there were lots of questions that didn't have answers. How much time is left? What are my options? How do I decide? And how do I tell people? Fast forward to my time in grad school, and I found myself in a program focused on healthcare. And for the majority of the time that I've been in this program, I've worked with this interdisciplinary team to create and run a company called Canopy. Our core product is a web application that helps people talk about and make end-of-life healthcare decisions. It's offered as an extension of the services provided by your health system or hospital, and it's a planning tool that helps families find the answers they might need someday. Canopy makes the process of what's called advanced care planning simpler. We follow a model similar to TurboTax that breaks everything into manageable pieces. We allow people to record their wishes in their own words through video so that we can capture the nuance that's often lost in written documents. At the end of the process, people walk away with a signed advanced care directive, a legal document that contains their wishes that they can share with their loved ones and medical providers. And as a digital technology, we make that sharing easier so that everyone, families and providers alike, have answers when they need them. But as we went through the process of creating Canopy, I had lots of questions. What if we inadvertently influence a family to make a decision they later regret? How do we balance the power dynamics in healthcare? And what is good or bad design in a situation where what you're talking about is literally life and death? All of these questions led me back to ethics. Now, this is the most complicated slide on my entire presentation, but I want to give everyone a little primer on ethics so that we're all on the same page. We'll get through it together. So the first thing you should know is that at a high level, ethics is divided into 3 areas. They're listed on the left. They're organized based on how close or far they are from reality or the day-to-day. Meta-ethics lives way up in the stratosphere, thinking high-level thoughts, and applied ethics is much closer to the ground. On top of that, layered over them, are 3 primary theories that you should know. There are more, and people argue back and forth about these ones all the time, but for our purposes, there are 3 theories. So I want you to imagine that you're a student, and you've just seen a classmate cheat on an exam, and you're trying to figure out what to do. You can think of the theories a little bit like lenses through which to see the world, and figure out what is good. So if you're the student, if you look through the lens of virtue ethics, what you would try to think of is an ideal person, and then you would do what they would do. If you look through the lens of deontology, what you would try to think about are all the rules and expectations that are set, the norms of our society. So you might look to your school's honor code and act to the letter of the law. And the third lens, if you look through the eyes of consequentialism, what you would do is try to figure out the outcomes of all of your actions. So if I tell the teacher, this would happen. If I don't tell the teacher, that would happen. And then you make the choice that do the action that will give you the best or most positive outcome. That's it, that's the primer. So, back to my questions. What I did is I looked around, which basically means I read a lot of papers, 237 to be exact, and I looked to see what design had to say about ethics. As a young discipline, we don't have a whole lot of literature. We have some, and it's great, but there are still lots and lots of open questions. But we're growing, and recent events like the data breaches at Facebook shed light on the fact that as a discipline, we need to think carefully about the ethical implications of the communications, products, services, and systems that we're designing. So as a design discipline, we're now more prevalent than ever. Our processes are being used in more and more places. Design thinking workshops are now commonplace in the world of business. Design is being used in healthcare to help improve health outcomes. And for our for our executive branch and for our lawmakers, we're bringing design methodologies to help influence the way that we make and execute our laws. But, like the quote from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. We need to think about, in deeper ways, what the systems and services we're designing are doing, because we're being asked fundamentally to do more and more complex things. And with those with the levels of complexity that are being added, there are additional implications that are getting added onto. There are some designers who have done really great jobs of understanding the intersections between design and some of the most pressing social issues of our world. Designers and scholars like Victor Papanek, Liz Sanders, and Sarah Hendren have looked at ways that design intersects sustainability and accessibility and inclusion. But this isn't exactly what I needed as I was looking to work on Canopy. So I looked more broadly, and I reviewed the other disciplines that exist in the world and tried to see if we could figure out what they were doing. And I found that there are 7 components, give or take a little bit, that are pretty universal to mature disciplines that have well-established ethical standards. I'm going to go through each of them against design and just give you a sense of where we are as a discipline. So the first is values. Design right now sort of has values. There are lots of things that we would claim as unique to design. We'll talk about being human-centered and caring a lot for the people that we design with and for. But we haven't really ratified them. There's no central location where you can go and figure out these are the values of design. Individual designers have values, but as a unit, we don't have them. Then there are codes of conduct. And this we actually have. So in design, the professional organizations that guide our activities, almost all of them have a code of conduct that we should follow as professionals in the world of design. I will say though that most of these cover the business goings on of design and don't actually really talk about the thing you're designing. Then there are governance structures. This we don't really have. So in other disciplines like journalism, there are established independent centers that help guide and understand the whole entire industry. They work to understand how journalists can think about ethics and to establish the values of their work. We don't have this. The other thing is that on a lower level in health systems or hospitals, there are lots of regulations and committees and structures that are used to evaluate the ethical implications of our work. We don't really have this either. Then there's public discourse, which we also have a little bit of. I watched and listened to many lectures and talks and speeches about ethics and design as part of this project. And we do talk about ethics and we think about the good that we should be doing in the world. But we tend to remain high level. So I didn't hear very many examples of people who are really digging deep into a specific issue and evaluating the details of what's going on. Then there are evaluation frameworks, methods and tools to think about the ethical implications of what we're doing. In design we have some, but they're kind of scattered and they're not easy to find. This is actually the focus of what we'll be talking about a lot, so I'll talk more about this later. And there are ethical tools, or educational tools rather. These are often cases. In other disciplines like law and medicine and business, we use cases to teach ethics to students. They help unpack the stories of the past and help people evaluate their own personal and professional moral systems. In design, we don't have cases yet. We haven't well established how to document or talk about some of the issues that we face as designers. And it's one of the most important things I think we could do as a discipline. It falls beyond the scope of work I did, but if anybody wants to spend time on this, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And then there are best practices. So things that we should do continually. And in design, we actually have some of these, but they're distributed. So we have good best practices against privacy. We have good best practices against accessibility standards. But they kind of live in wherever, and if you don't know where to look, you probably won't find them. So overall, we're not yet supporting ethics. Not well, anyway. There are much more mature disciplines who have figured out how to have all 7 of those components. But it's really important that we figure out how to do this as a discipline. I kept thinking a lot about what I would need as I was working on Canopy. And one of the things I landed on was process. So if I was thinking about the ethical implications of what I was doing, I needed it to match to the process that I was going through. This is a commonly known process model in design. For those non-designers, it basically is a step-by-step guide to the types of activities that we do. It's pretty flexible and you can kind of go through it lots of different ways. But I've used it in the past and I've used it in this program to help organize and structure my thinking about the process that I go through as a designer. But this model, the one that I follow to do the work that I do, doesn't yet include ethics explicitly. There's no mention of it. It was made by a guy named Vijay Kumar, and his book is wonderful, but it doesn't talk about the ethical implications at each stage. But if I look to other disciplines, like law and medicine and journalism, they have well-established processes. They have thought about how their ethics integrate with the work that they do. And like I figured, if we couldn't right now steal from design or figure out what to do, why don't we steal from others and look to these other disciplines as models? So here's what I did. I took this process model and I broke it into the 7, they're called modes, but they're the steps of the process. Then what I did is I looked at the activities that happen in each of the steps and I tried to think about all the ethical questions or implications that I saw, and I listed them. And then I looked to the literature of other disciplines and tried to see where the activities that we as designers are doing in each step match the activities that the other disciplines are doing. And I tried to make a list. Now there's a lot here, and I won't go through all of this because I don't have time, but I wanted to break down one of them just to show you a little bit about how the system breaks down. So step 6 of the process is called frame solutions. It's the step where designers are already decided on a concept and they're building it out and deciding what it really looks like in the world. Now, if we think about other disciplines that build interventions for people and do things to kind of change the world, medicine is a good example. And in medicine, as a mature discipline, they have all of those 7 components I showed you earlier. One of them is that they have a system of values. There are 4 well-established values in medicine that are used to guide the decisions that people make. The first is autonomy, non-malfeasance, which is do no harm, beneficence, and justice. They're held in tension in the process of medicine. And in a similar way, if you were to use them as a designer, you could replace the idea of intervening into a patient's life into intervening in a user's life. You can also, depending on the project, use some of the other components, like a governance structure. So say I'm a designer working on a really complicated project, I need to future-proof it. Governance structures and models that are used in medicine can also be used in design. And I want to illustrate this with how it's kind of played out in my work with Canopy. So, in our business model in Canopy, we have 2 key audiences. The first is the people who use our product. We're building tools that help patients and families talk about end-of-life healthcare and make decisions. But our customers are health systems and hospitals who serve them. And our value proposition to each of these audiences is very different. For families and patients, we're providing them peace of mind as they navigate their journey through the complexities of modern medicine. But for health systems, our value is that we help them reduce costs. Studies have shown that just having what's called an advanced care planning conversation, which is what Canopy does, can help cut the cost of end-of-life healthcare pretty substantially. Because we reduce the number of interventions that happen even though a family or a patient wouldn't have wanted them. But I think a lot about the challenges that this provides. So in our modern system, what happens is that we tend to act by default. Doctors, medical providers do things to either save a life or improve the health of a person. But in some situations, that's not necessarily the best thing. And it's definitely in other situations not necessarily what a family would want. And right now in the US, we have a system where health systems, though they are in almost all situations focused on patient-centered care, are also businesses. They, like Canopy and other businesses, have to make money. And I worry that our benefit to them to reduce costs could often be abused. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night and that I stress about. Because if we think about it right now, I firmly believe that the desires of the patients and the families and the desires of the health systems are aligned. But if at some point in the future they become not aligned, I worry that we won't see it in time or that we won't know what to do about it. The other tension that's in the world of what we're building is the bias that we're intrinsically creating. I worry often about what we're putting into Canopy and about the questions and the topics that we have people talk about, because I worry about the influence it has on their lives and their outcomes. I was trained last fall as a certified advanced care planning facilitator, and at that training, one of the things that they did is they evaluated everybody based on their ability to be a neutral party. But I have a hard time with neutrality in this context because I think it's really, really challenging to be neutral. I don't think it's possible. I think everything that we do, every decision we make, is introducing a bias. And it's one of the tensions that also exists in Canopies. Are the content of what we're doing actually valuing and emphasizing the person and what they should want? So, in Canopy in itself, we've used medical ethics as a way to understand and impact this. I'm 100% sure we're going to make lots of mistakes. Everyone does, we're human. But we've been able to use medical ethics against the process that we're following, which is the design methodology, to help unpack as a team what exactly we are intending and what some of the values we are emphasizing are or are not. So, as a conclusion, the framework that I'm proposing today is just the beginning. As a discipline, we have lots and lots of work to do to think about the ethics of what we're doing in design. But I hope what it can do is provide a little bit of organization and help make sure that we can get there a little faster. So as people design tools like Canopy and try to help people like Robert navigate the complexities of the 21st century, we can do that with ethics in mind and think about the good and the outcomes of our actions. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has about anything in here. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious if the health systems that you've interacted with up to this point can see an ethical problem themselves.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I've explicitly asked that question to anybody. What I will say though is that in general, the health systems we talk to have constantly kind of emphasized their need for kind of patient-centered care. And what an advanced care plan tends to do is provide formal documentation of what a patient wants. And oftentimes what happens in healthcare is that they just don't even know. So I talked a little bit about sharing earlier in the process, but if you have an advanced care directive, the likelihood is that you made it in your lawyer's office. You did it maybe alone, maybe with your spouse, but it ended up most likely in a drawer somewhere, which means that if your kids needed access to it or someone else did, they probably don't have access to it. And the health systems in general would love to know more about what you want, and they often don't. So I haven't heard any like severe tensions or like concerns ethically, but I do think that there are people concerned that they are acting in opposition to what a patient would want just because they don't have the documents or the formalities that they need in place to do what the patient wants. Any other questions? Yeah.
What I'm curious about how outside of the healthcare condition, and maybe something along the lines of the mortician, informs this decision making, because you know, in the sense of the sort of afterlife processes, there's a lot of pre-planning, and people spend a lot of time, not only individually, but sometimes also with their family, planning the sort of procedure of death itself. And I'm wondering how that sort of influences that type of thinking, or sort of maybe even the remembrance mechanisms even after death, the sort of role of the memorial or the moratorium, or you know, how do these sort of other strings along this sort of sequence that you're outlined begin to influence the ethics beyond the healthcare and the sort of up to that moment condition?
Yeah. I probably have an imperfect answer to your question.
That's okay.
So the question was what the kind of other planning processes that you would go through during the course of death, so planning for memorial services or other like estate planning matters, how that would impact the ethics of what we're doing. I will say, so Canopy doesn't actually do any of those things, the first thing I'll say. We're focused literally on the process of healthcare in advance of you needing them. So it's not like an emergency service where you would do it in the hospital 10 seconds before you would need to go under anesthesia or do something else. It's a well in advance you're trying to plan. What I will say is that I think what hopefully is happening is that individuals and families are making choices themselves. And what I guess I don't know exactly where it's gonna change their minds, but I think that by giving them more tools and understanding of what the processes are going to be, so whether that is estate planning or some of the other afterlife things that you're doing, you can hopefully give people a little better sense of control and a little more insight into the process, which right now is a pretty opaque thing. People in the US in general don't like to talk about death, and so they often don't do planning activities unless they have very clear steps for how to do it or clear incentives or a need to do it.
The reason why I asked that is because, I mean, as the US becomes a more globally centered entity, right, the sort of culture of death and when and where we begin thinking about it changes. The dynamic of that, I mean, the role of funerary processes, even by themselves, as sort of the death ladders approaching in New York City, changes the way in which that mechanism is designed, right? And I think that that's a sort of golden opportunity to sort of continue the conversation forward. Is how the sort of role of ethics influence the planning procedure when we think of a more global dynamic, right? And it's sort of not the just singular U.S. approach.
Yeah. Here in the U.S., we have very like structured thinking around death, and in other cultures, it's much more fluid, and there are less kind of stigmas associated with it, and it becomes a more communal activity. I talked a little bit about the trip in Johannesburg, and I lived there for a summer. And they have actually like death ceremonies that are community engagements, basically. So everyone in the community chips in to pay for funeral costs, and it becomes a big celebration. So it's a very different exercise, I guess. And I agree. I think it'll probably change quite a bit as we become a more global society. Yeah.
So design as a discipline has such a deep history in client-based work or consumables, where the designer sort of slipstreamed into somebody else's values. So I love that you're talking about ethics, but can you talk about the tension between working with those outside clients or in that consumable environment and retaining your own ethical identity?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, I guess. The question for everyone, if you couldn't hear, was there is a general tension between the idea of designers as a service, so we're providing a value to a client or some external factor where we're slipped into the process, probably not at the beginning, and are maybe serving their values and not our own. I will say that I think one of the challenges of design in general, and it's why I think the education piece is so important, is that we don't often know a whole lot about ethics before we enter the field and the profession. And I think that's one of the areas where we can kind of improve our engagement with other people. There's one of the, I just in general feel like if you know more about something, you can better engage and kind of understand where those tensions are. I think historically we've, like you said, slipped into the end of the process or sort of followed whatever is happening. But I think more and more we are being asked to, and part of the focus of this program is looking at what happens when design is engaged at the very core of a project and process. So we're at what we call the fuzzy front end, which is where we don't know what we're doing, we're trying to figure out what's important. And I think as more and more of that happens, it's important for us to know what our own ethical systems are, so that if there is tension among an interdisciplinary team, we can at least kind of talk about things with a little bit of fluency. Yeah.
Can you just say a few more words about your collaborators?
Yeah, okay. So neither of them could be here. I apologize. They would have loved to have been here. Elizabeth, Michelle, hold on, let me show you. Show their photos. Maybe I can get there. Lots and lots of slides. There they are. So Anne is in the middle and Elizabeth is on the right. So Elizabeth Michelle graduated last year from the School of Public Health. She got her degree in health education and health behavior. Her background is in policy and health policy, and she worked in that before coming to grad school. And then Anne is right now in the Masters of Health Informatics program, graduating in the spring, which is a joint degree between the School of Information and the School of Public Health, and focused a lot about like the information systems in healthcare, which is basically what Canopy is working on, so her expertise is very useful. I know them, so Anne is the matchmaker between the three of us. So Anne and I went to high school together a long time ago, and hadn't seen each other until grad school, but reconnected. And she was the one who convinced me that I should do a program called Innovation in Action here on campus, which Anne Verheenke, who can wave to everybody, runs, which is run through the School of Public Health. And so Anne and Elizabeth knew each other because they had both worked in Rwanda at a community health network there. So. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious to know if the Canopy app exists yet. Is it available? Can you find it at the App Store? That's one question.
Okay.
The other is that you seem to be addressing the medical healthcare community, the legal community, and the general public. And do you have a strategy or a sequence that you're going to go after those, become a successful profit-making business?
Sure, okay. Yeah, so the question is about one, the status of Canopy, which I can tell you, and then two, our kind of approach to the ecosystems that we're part of, so healthcare, law, and the broader community. So Canopy is not available in the App Store yet, but we actually did just receive our first beta testing link yesterday. So we're running through some user testing at the moment to finalize it, but hopefully in the next month or so it'll be done. So we're likely looking to pilot it this summer, and we're working on figuring out exactly who our partner is for that. The other question is about approach. We've looked a lot at who has the biggest pain in this area, and there are lots of potential providers. So the legal community is doing this process right now, and not necessarily doing it with a whole lot of medical knowledge. So you likely, if you have an advanced care plan, filled it out at your lawyer's office, but did it as part of your will and trust and other estate planning matters. And it was probably a little checkbox that you went through and were don't do CPR, do make sure that I have breathing and feeding assistance. And most people don't actually go through a kind of a more detailed process to unpack the three things that we cover. So one of the things we do is help people identify a medical proxy. So it's one of the most important decisions that you can make is who decides on your behalf. And actually in the state of Michigan, it's the only thing that's legally binding. So there are other supporting documents that can go along with it, but they are used as a guide and will not hold up in court. So that person that you've designated is ultimately the decider and can use that document to help inform them, but they're the person who makes the call. The second thing that we have people go through are a lot of questions about their values and some of their goals in life. It's one of the things that helps provide a lot of context to people as they're making decisions, because there's only so much you can plan for in advance, and the complexity of medicine means that likely what you've thought about already is not the situation you will find yourself in. But having an understanding of what's really important to a person, what makes a good day really great, can help people really understand what to do or what to prioritize if they're making a choice. And then the third thing we go through are some of the basic medical questions that come up frequently, so questions like CPR. In answer to your original question, the place with the most pain tends to be health systems. So the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services actually has a number of quality metrics that they've set on certain parts of health systems to ensure that people have records of people's advanced care directives. And a lot of health systems don't meet that standard. So in the US right now, only 37% of people who are over the age of 55 have an advanced care directive, which is a low number in general, because it means a lot of people enter a health system without an identified medical proxy, without a bunch of these things in place. And it means that health systems often even have less of those documents. So whether you've entered the health system or not before, the likelihood that you actually had the paperwork in the right place is pretty low. So health systems are probably our first customer, if you will. But I think the other communities are kind of an important part. There's a reason we also have a consumer brand, why we call it Canopy, and why it's not X health systems tool. It's really important for us that the user experience stays really high, and as I feel like anybody in healthcare will tell you, sometimes things fall by the wayside in terms of quality of user experience. But we really want to make sure that's very high so that the general public can engage with it and look at it as a quality experience that is on par with all the other digital services that they use. Question? Sorry, go for it.
I'm curious of the connectedness between health systems.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if my documents are in the University of Michigan health system, however, I have a catastrophe or whatever in Petoskey or Tallahassee or wherever it might be.
Yeah, so not great, I guess. There are lots of what are called EMR systems, which are the electronic medical record systems. The largest one in the US by far is Epic. It's what Michigan Medicine uses and what lots of healthcare systems uses. They do an okay job, I guess, of getting documents between Epic systems. So if you happen to be in another place, one of the reason why Canopy exists is we're a separate profile. So a loved one can quickly pull up a link to your answers and your documentation in an emergency, because that is a challenge, right? Because getting documents from one health system to another right now tends to happen by fax machine, which if anybody's used a fax machine in a while, but that's often how documents get transferred between health systems, and it's a pretty arcane process. But what we can do is sit as an outside profile for people and then sync to whichever EMR systems they need us to be in. So a health system can request the record, but also a loved one can pull it up on their phone.
May I ask another question?
Yeah, of course.
You were chatting and talking for how the state of Michigan has made it possible for donors to identify themselves on their license.
Yeah. What's your question about that?
Your concept of being put on driver's license.
Oh, I think that's great. So there are lots of other places where this should probably live. Apple actually in their new health kit has a place for you to upload an advanced directive. And so we're trying to think about how do you get this in as many places as possible. It would be great if it could exist in your driver's license. It's probably too much information to exist there. So there's no standard format for an advanced directive. You can put literally whatever you want in it. It tends to be that you answer some basic medical questions and you talk about your values. But if you want to write an open letter, that can go in your advanced directive. It's why we have videos alongside of it, because people can talk about whatever is important to them. So in implementation, that all is probably not going to fit on your license, but there probably is ways to access a link on your license, and I think that would be great. There's one question back there. Yeah, that's you.
So, great work. So many questions. The one I want to ask is has sort of been addressed.
failure in a healthcare process. So like using those values and those questions to help frame a general like care plan instead of just the end of life.
Yeah, so I will say that we don't really control what health systems will do with this, but I think that would be a great thing. So the question was, what could we do to kind of use this answers, the information about values to talk well in advance of the end of life. And an advanced care plan can theoretically be applied at any point. It's there in case of emergency where somebody can't speak for themselves, but it could be used obviously by providers at any point. And I would love for that to happen more than anything. What we can do is kind of make sure that a health system or your provider has access to that information. One of the challenges that you mentioned and that's come up for us a lot is that right now in most healthcare situations, time is money and people don't have a lot of it. So if you are having an advanced care planning conversation, the training I went to actually talked about how to do it in 15 minutes, which is not a lot of time if you're making really important life decisions. And what we hope to do is kind of decentralize that process and make it so that you can take things home, talk about it with your loved ones, and have ample amounts of time to kind of explore what your values are.
I was just thinking about from the patient empowerment angle.
Yeah.
Like in testing it, we will explore whether or not patients bring that on their own to clinical encounters.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot. So most people just don't have them. There are some examples. So I'm a part of a Facebook community called Slow Medicine that I would recommend if anyone's interested. And I've seen several posts of people talking about like them putting their advanced directive in like a plastic baggie in their purse so that they can make sure that it like survives a weather incident and is always on them. But I haven't heard a lot of examples of somebody using that information in like a general practitioner's office or like your primary care physician. But I think it would be useful likely. The question is time always, so, but I think if it could be packaged, that'd be great. Yeah.
Hey Brendan, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the ethical questions you've come up with as you were kind of piloting this summer and in terms of like how it's embedded into healthcare systems and how information is shared, et cetera.
Yeah, so I have lots of concerns about data and privacy always. So that's one of the things that we are focusing heavily on is how do we make sure this is all secure and that it's accurate as much as we can make sure. So one of the big challenges, I guess, is that oftentimes there are like multiple documents. So I spoke to a woman in last fall who has 2 advanced directives in existence. One's in the state of Michigan and one is in the state of California. And they identified different people as her medical proxy, which basically means that the situation just gets really complicated because if she's in the state of Michigan, one person can make a choice and in another state it can't. And then if she's in a third state, nobody knows. So different laws guide different states. Some of the other challenges, I guess, were what I've mentioned. So a lot of the ethical questions I have are like about what to include or not include, because there's a limited capacity that people have to like go through this process, and it's hard to go through it in general, and it's harder if it's really, really, really long. So I have lots of Post-its up on my wall in the studio of like possible topics that you could talk about, and they're like super detailed, like are you an organ donor, where is your organ registered, or organ donation status registered, so in the state of Michigan with whatever. But there are lots of questions about like what do we include and not include. And I've specifically struggled a lot with values questions and how to navigate that given the very human population that we have, knowing that my value systems are very different than probably everybody who uses our system. And when we talk about things like CPR or talk about other types of medical interventions, I worry a lot that we're like biasing someone and presenting that information as honestly from opposite viewpoints. So to give you some context, CPR in terms of like just raw numbers, not super effective. It's like 17% effective for like a very healthy person. And if you've already like had a heart attack or had some sort of other major trauma, the number goes way, way down to like 2 or 3%. But presenting that number is obviously like a very scary and biasing thing. And so we look a lot at like, okay, if we tell them this, can we tell them something else to make sure that they know that it's still a valid intervention? And in some situations, they may want it and it may be useful to them. And if they do want it, we don't want to dissuade them from it. So I have lots of questions often about like just how do we phrase things? How do we talk about them? Yeah.
Last question.
Oh, yeah, go for
I was
it.
going to ask, does any of your design work focus on the discussion between the proxy and the patient?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that is the missing piece. The documents, when you're practically dealing with a situation, are almost irrelevant.
Right.
It's really based on the shared understanding you have with whoever you're preparing.
Yeah, there's a really wonderful game actually. It's called Hello. It used to be called My Gift of Grace. That we've looked at as like a way to think about gamifying the experience of talking to somebody. And we've looked at lots of ways for our like video recordings to be actually like a Skype conversation or something where you could effectively record a conversation between two people and do this process naturally as if you were just talking to somebody. And we're looking at technical ways to use what's called natural language processing to pull out information from there to make the process of like putting that into a document a little easier. So you could effectively have a conversation with a sibling or a child about what's going on and have it pretty naturally so we can guide you through the basic questions and then we can pull out information and context. I will say that's probably version 2 of Canopy, but it's on our roadmap and it's something that we're looking into a lot because it's important. Cool, thank you.